All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are glad to have you all with us today for History's Lunch. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we are in our home, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we are also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, where you can watch any of our previous History's Lunch programs at any time. At this time, I'll remind you to go ahead and silence your cell phone. Also, I hope you will join us at Juneteenth Jubilee at the two Mississippi Museums, sponsored by Ingalls Shipbuilding. This program will celebrate community culture and Black history tomorrow, Thursday, June 19th, from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. This family-friendly celebration will feature live artistic performances, yard games, a line dancing workshop, local food trucks, and an adult area in the auditorium with bingo and trivia with a nice adult beverage station as well. We'll also have a kids zone with some inflatable obstacle courses on the plaza and a whole lot more. And so we hope that you'll come and join us, explore the museums, also with some special Juneteenth themed educational guides and flash tours. The museums also from Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday as usual are free thanks to the sponsorship to Ingalls. So we encourage you to have your family and friends come and join us at some point over the next 4 days. And we hope you'll come back and join us next week, June 25th, for Andrew Carl's presentation on the Black struggle for tax justice in Mississippi. But today we are excited to welcome Linda Barnickel, an archivist and freelance writer with master's degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and The Ohio State University. Her book, Milliken's Bend, A Civil War Battle in History and Memory, was heralded as stellar by the Civil War Times, and On Point Journal of Army History declared it a must-read. It received the Jules and Francis Landry Award from the LSU Press for the most outstanding achievement in Southern Studies, and the A.M. Pate Jr. Award from the Fort Worth Civil War Roundtable for outstanding research and writing on the Trans-Mississippi Theater of War. She appeared at the Southern Festival of Books, the African American Civil War Museum, the Vicksburg National Military Park, and a number of Civil War roundtables. So please help me welcome Ms. Linda Barnickel.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I'm very grateful to be here speaking to you, and thank you all so much for coming out to listen. Milliken's Bend is a really important but too often forgotten battle in the Civil War. And I'm going to start with Louisiana. Now, it did take place in Louisiana, but just across the river, and it was part of the Vicksburg campaign. The area of Milliken's Bend is up here in the vicinity of Carroll and Madison parishes, up here in the upper right corner. And this map shows the percentage of slave population in this region according to the 1860 census in the kind of deep purple grape color, Madison Parish and so forth, right along the river. Percentage of enslaved individuals as part of the entire population in those parishes was 80 to 90%. Up in Carroll Parish, the upper right, 70 to 79%. And that's before the war. And so if you kind of fast forward a little bit into 1863, which is the time period we're going to be talking about with Milliken's Bend, the white young men of military age have gone off into the Army, and so this population skews even higher at that point. And the reason I show this map, and the reason that this is important, is because in 1859, you have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And it was his desire and his hope that there would be a great slave uprising all throughout the South, all across the United States, and that freedom would come at last. Well, as we know, that didn't quite happen then. But what did happen was that raid made much of the slaveholding South on edge because they feared that that would come to pass. And when you look at the numbers here, you can imagine the kind of fear that these white planters would have had about that in this region even before the Civil War came. Now, this fear is going to be important as we go on in the story. So this is why I kind of begin with this part of it. Here's another map that gives you a better idea of where Milliken's Bend is. You see it in relation to Vicksburg as well as Jackson. And I'm going to begin the main part of the Milliken's Bend story in April of 1863, in the spring. So Grant's army has been in this region in this region up here, kind of north of Milliken's Bend, right, hugging right up along the river, for some time. He spent the winter of 62, 63 digging canals and trying to bypass Vicksburg. But by the spring of 1863, the Union Army is like gathering its strength, gathering its forces, gathering supplies, getting ready to make that big move down the West Bank and then on into Mississippi and up to Vicksburg. So they're just about ready to do that. Off to the west here at Monroe, that's where the Confederates are. And the big region in between these two rivers is kind of a no man's land. Both sides are in and out of there, but nobody really is kind of staying in that area. So in April, just as Grant's army is getting ready to make its move, hundreds and then thousands of the formerly enslaved people in this region start coming into the Union lines. And it happens pretty suddenly and quite quickly. And often, as you can see in this image, they don't have a lot that is with them. You know, maybe a couple of days change of clothes, maybe a few provisions, maybe for a week. So you have thousands of people coming into the Union lines, and the Union Army is not prepared for this in any way, shape, or form. And so the Union Army is very quickly overwhelmed. They need their supplies for their army because they're getting ready to go on Vicksburg. And it's very quickly like a true humanitarian crisis. What happens is they began to kind of gather these freed people in what are called contraband camps. And contraband, that term has kind of its own history, and I'm not going to take time now to tell you about that. But many Yankee soldiers termed freed people contraband. So you will see that in a lot of resources. So they talk about these contraband camps, which are basically like refugee camps. And that's an effort to try to get a handle on the situation. But again, it's kind of out of control and a lot of chaos, and they're not really able to provide for them. And it's springtime, and so if somebody says, well, you know what, it's spring, it's planting season, these people have worked this land, they know how to make crops grow, let's put them back on the plantation, and they can grow crops for themselves to help feed them and help feed the army. Important difference, they're going to be paid for their work. And that also disperses them, so you have less risk of a major disease outbreak. There's shelter that's available on these plantations. So it's kind of a way to kind of try to get the Union Army to get a handle on the situation. The plantations are leased out to northern businessmen who come south for this purpose to operate these plantations. And as I said, they will be paid wages. Now, at the same time, in the middle of all of this that I've described, still in April, you have Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas. He is an Army figure from basically what we would call today like a Pentagon official. He's very high up in the Army, and he's from D.C. So he comes out to the Mississippi Valley, where Grant's army is, and he kind of goes up and down the river making stump speeches to Grant's men, who are experienced veterans. And the reason he has come to the Mississippi Valley is, in his own words, I am here to recruit as many black regiments as I can. Now, at this point in time, the use and organization of black regiments was a very new thing. This is kind of like the kickoff for that. And he is recruiting white officers from Grant's army to become officers in these new African American regiments. This is an image of one of those men who was at Milliken's Bend, and it's actually from the collections here at the museum. His name is Jonathan Pickerel. He served with the 11th Louisiana Infantry, African descent. Now, the officers were, at this point in time, to be white men only, and that was to be the case for most of the war. They had a variety of motivations. Some of these men were dedicated abolitionists. They had been advocating for freedom since the very beginning. So some of them were very committed and were excited about this prospect and looked forward to leading this effort. But you also had a number of men who quite literally were just in it for the money, because they could get a promotion from being a sergeant to being a captain, for instance, and that might be 3 times an advance in pay. Plus, they have the prestige of being an officer. And along with that, at this point in time, the assumption was that these new African American regiments would not be put in harm's way. They would not be on the front lines of the battlefields. They would be at garrison posts far from the front lines. So you might even think it would be kind of a cushy job. You get increased pay, increased promotion, and you can kind of sit out the rest of the war and benefit from that, right? So you have a mix of people who are involved in this. Now, there is a little bit of a catch. These men would not receive their new pay until their regiment was recruited to full strength, and they themselves were responsible for going out and doing the recruiting. So they have incredible incentives to sign up as many men as possible in these regiments as quickly as they can, because then they'll get paid. And in fact, what they do is there's cases of where they go on to these plantations that are being operated now by these northern businessmen. They say, okay, all the men come out. Okay, you're in the army, come with me, just like that. And some of the plantation commissioners are complaining about this practice, so we know that it happened. And but of course, you know, many of the African American men were very excited and proud of having the opportunity of finally taking up a weapon and fighting for the freedom of their own people and their families. And this is a scene of what it might have looked like as the officers are going out recruiting on these plantations. Now, one of the things I always like to point out as well is in the lower left here, you see some of the women, and I don't know about you, but I see a few worried looks on their faces. And of course, they're concerned about their husbands going off, but also when their menfolk go off, they are left very vulnerable to the few planters who are still in the region and to white Yankee soldiers who think that they're just there to serve at their pleasure. And so it's a case of, you know, the men want to go serve, but at the same time, they want to protect their families. So that's a real tension for them. And then once the officers are in place, once the black enlisted men are signed up, then of course they need to be doing their training. And keep in mind that the officers are new at their jobs too, so they're having to learn their new duties and responsibilities. The freed people, they're coming in and they're new at military discipline. They're new, of course, with their weaponry. And in fact, with the troops at Milliken's Bend, they were given third-rate weapons that had already been condemned by the Union ordnance officers to use at their camps. So just to kind of step back for a minute and kind of review where we've been. So January 1st, Lincoln issues the final Emancipation Proclamation, and that is what provides for the enlistment of black men as soldiers in the Union Army. Prior to that time, they had only been considered laborers. In April, Adjutant General Thomas comes and he begins to recruit the officers. And then those officers in turn go out and begin to recruit the black enlisted men. And everybody is learning their new duties and responsibilities. So we're now at the end of May. June 7th is the Battle of Milliken's Bend. Many of these African American soldiers had only been in service not more than a month. Not more than a month. And some of them only for a couple of weeks or a couple of days. Some of them had not yet been issued uniforms. Some of them yet hadn't even had the paperwork signed out yet. So as artists' renderings go, this is a relatively accurate depiction of the nature of the fighting at Milliken's Bend. And I'd like to just briefly read a couple of passages to give you a sense of what this part of the battle was like. And the Confederate troops are from Texas, and the Union troops are from Louisiana and Mississippi. The Texans overwhelmed the Yankees on the levee, carrying it instantly and inflicted many casualties. Joseph P. Blessington of the 16th Texas Infantry said the Yankees stampeded pell-mell over the levee in great terror and confusion. Our troops followed after them, bayoneting them by the hundreds. John M. Wright of the 16th Texas Dismounted Cavalry agreed. We made it hot for those Negroes. There was not one left to tell the tale. Peter Gravis with the 17th Texas Infantry later recalled the scene with an exhilaration born of battle and a warrior's memory. We turned loose our war dogs, and I tell you, my readers, they howled. We clubbed guns, bayoneted, cut with the sword until the enemy fled helter-skelter. First Lieutenant David Cornwell, who's one of the Union officers, watched the initial attack from his position in reserve with 2 companies of the 9th Louisiana just back of the first levee. Captain Heath and 2nd Lieutenant Smith were with Company B on the far left of the Union line. Heath took up a musket to aid in the defense, but the Southern forces poured over the levee like a tidal wave. Cornwell saw Heath and a few others nearby cut off, absorbed by the Confederate line as prisoners. Seeing his comrades overwhelmed, Cornwell sprang into action, yelling, "Now bounce them bullies," as he led his men forward. Big Jack Jackson, who's one of the freedmen, lunged ahead into the melee, smashing his rifle butt into any rebel within range. Within moments, he held only the barrel of his weapon. The wooden stock had shattered in his hands. Cornwell saw Jack stabbed multiple times by bayonets, but his friend did not slow down. Because of his size and his fury, Jack became a special target for the Confederates. He was soon killed by a bullet to the head. So I think you can see that that matches quite well what we see here. So to explain a little bit more of exactly what happened at Milliken's Bend. So the Confederate forces were in charge of Brigadier General Henry McCulloch, and his superior was Major General John G. Walker of Walker's Texas Division. So the Confederate forces were all from Texas. And even though there's a cavalry unit listed there, they had been dismounted quite a while before, so they were fighting as infantry. On the Union side, you have Herman Lieb. He's a Swedish immigrant, and he's in charge of what was known as the African Brigade that day. Now, he's only temporarily in command because normally Isaac Shepard would have been in charge. And Isaac Shepard is a dedicated abolitionist, but at the time of the battle, he was placed under arrest. And it wasn't because he was drunk on duty or anything like that. The reason he was under arrest was because a few days before, there were some white Illinois troops posted nearby. A couple of them had gotten drunk and come into his camp and had begun beating up one of his soldiers. So what he did was he ordered some of his black enlisted men to whip these white soldiers from this Illinois regiment. And you can imagine that didn't really go over very well. And so as a result, Shepard was placed under arrest. Now he was later absolved because in part he was sick and tired of seeing his own troops abused by white Union soldiers. After all, we're supposed to be on the same side, right? So But in any case, he's kind of out of the picture. He's present, but he cannot issue orders during the battle. So we have Herman Lieb in charge. And these are the forces of the African Brigade, the 1st Mississippi Infantry, 9th Louisiana Infantry, 11th Louisiana Infantry, and 13th Louisiana Infantry. The AD stands for African Descent. Now, in addition, Colonel Lieb thought there was probably going to be an attack pretty soon, so he had requested some reinforcements, and 125 men from the all-white 23rd Iowa Infantry came in as support. Now, I do say that 125 men is half of a regiment, and probably many of you know that a regiment at full strength in the Civil War was 1,000 men. 23rd Iowa had been in service for some time, and they had also taken very heavy casualties at Big Black River Bridge just a few weeks before. And so 125 men was half of the regiment by this time in the war. Now, the 23rd Iowa was also the only true veterans present at Milliken's Bend. The Texas forces had been in service for about a year and a half or so, and they had done a lot of marching, but they had not really been in any major battles. So they were the only ones that really had any true battle-tested experience. So this is kind of a map here of what took place. That passage that I read you and that image that I showed earlier, that's taking place down here at the bottom of the line. The blue is the Union, the red is the Confederates. You see they're backed up right up against the Mississippi River. And these two heavy lines here are levees, which basically were serving as breastworks. The 9th Louisiana is posted here on the side. The Confederates get an angle on them and just roll up their line. Their line disintegrates because the Confederates are coming around the corner here. And that passage that I read earlier, that a lot of hand-to-hand combat is taking place in this area as well. The 1st Mississippi and the 13th Louisiana appear to have fallen back. Now, I don't know if they were ordered back to withdraw to seek that second position as a position of strength once the 9th fell back, or if perhaps they panicked and ran. Accounts conflict, and we do know that some of the officers did, in fact, just run away as soon, the officers, mind you, ran away when the Confederates came in. The 23rd Iowa had spent the night on their transport vessel and were just getting into line of battle, and here come the Confederates. So they are forced back as well, just almost immediately. The 11th Louisiana was the largest regiment on the Union side. They were posted at this end. They also were forced to fall back, but 2 companies of the 11th Louisiana up here at the top were posted behind some cotton bales that served as breastworks. They stood their ground. So what you have then is, at this point in the battle, this whole section in between the 2 levees is where the Confederates are. And they're just about ready to push the Union forces literally into the Mississippi River. Well, the gunboat Choctaw comes up, and it begins throwing 100-pound shells into the Confederate lines, except most of those shells go over their heads. Except a few. They fall short, they're defective, and they inflict friendly fire casualties on their own troops. So the Confederates cannot advance because of the gunboat here. The Lexington also comes up a little bit later, and it also begins shelling. And so the Confederates then at that point realize they cannot make that final push into the river, and they are forced to withdraw. And that's kind of the conclusion of the Battle of Milliken's Bend. Here's an image of the Choctaw and the Lexington. And so when we look at the casualty figures, and I think they're very important. It's a lot of numbers, but I think they kind of tell the tale. So McCulloch's brigade, the Texans, lost 185 men. I should back up. Both sides had roughly between 1,200 and 1,500 men on each side. So that's the scale of the battle that we're looking at. McCullough's brigade lost 185 from all causes, and that's about a 12% loss. Now today we consider a 10% loss shocking. In the Civil War, of course, we know all of the battles were particularly horrific, but this shows that the black men fought with valor and with determination if they inflicted that many casualties on their Confederate opponents, particularly considering the lack of training and the poor weapons that they had. On the Union side, that poor little contingent of 125 men from the 23rd Iowa lost more than half of their force, killed and wounded. The African Brigade as a whole lost a third of its force, killed and wounded. And the 11th Louisiana had 107 men missing because 2 entire companies were captured in their entirety. They had been skirmishers early in the fight, and so they were captured very early on, just in their entirety. Well, let's take a closer look at the 9th Louisiana. Remember, they're the regiment who receives that initial attack on the lower end of that map, where all of that hand-to-hand fighting combat is taking place. They lost 195 men from all causes, which is 68% of their force. That is the highest percentage loss of any African American unit in the entire war. 23% killed in action, outright. That's greater than the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg. And for you Civil War buffs, you probably know that the 1st Minnesota has long claimed that distinction, but they lost more. 66 men killed outright, killed in action. Now again, on the scale of Civil War battles, that really doesn't sound like much, you know. But if you look at the numbers, that is the highest outright loss by any Union regiment in a single engagement in the entire Vicksburg campaign. More than Champions Hill, more than Big Black River Bridge, more than the assaults on Vicksburg in May. So it's significant. And nobody's heard of the 9th Louisiana or Milliken's Bend. Well, who won? As you might expect, depends on who you ask. Isaac Shepard was so proud of his men. He said, "I think there will be a future that will make this first regular battle against the blacks alone honorably historic." He was so proud. And what's significant about Milliken's Bend, there had been the battle at Port Hudson just about a week before this, in which black troops took part. In July, you have Fort Wagner in South Carolina, the 54th Massachusetts. But what's different about Milliken's Bend is the majority of the Union force were African American troops. At these other battles, African American troops were there and took a major part in the conflict, but they were part of a larger military organization, which involved a considerable number of white troops as well. So what Shepard is saying here is about against the blacks alone is quite true at this time. So Shepard thought it was a victory. They barely held on, but they held their ground, and they fought with great courage. So he saw it as a Union victory. Henry McCulloch, who was in charge of the Confederate troops, he thought they had won. They had nearly annihilated their enemy. They had run them into the river practically. And if it wasn't for the gunboats, they probably would have been successful in that effort. So to him, it was a victory. But he also had some very interesting words for his Union opponents. He said that the black troops fought with considerable obstinacy. So, coming from a Confederate general, imagine that. Now his superior, a couple levels up, is Richard Taylor. Taylor is very disappointed. he's not going to call it a loss, but he's not real pleased with the way things went. And he complains to McCulloch, "I have not seen such fear of gunboats since the start of the war." So he's disappointed. Now, Taylor's superior, way on up now in the Confederate command, is Edmund Kirby Smith. Edmund Kirby Smith is in charge of all the Confederate forces west of the Mississippi River. He says, "I hope that your subordinates," meaning Walker and McCulloch, "recognize the propriety of giving no quarter to armed Negroes and their officers." In other words, Edmund Kirby Smith does not want to hear about any prisoners being taken. They should be killed on the battlefield, even if they're surrendering. Now, in part, his statement is based on official Confederate policy. It was passed by the Confederate Congress in late April that authorized the execution of white officers serving in command of black troops on the charge of inciting a slave insurrection. Remember where I began this story, that fear of slave insurrection. This is where it comes to fruition. And also African Americans who were bearing arms against the Confederacy were to be handed over to state authorities where they would be tried on the charge of participating in a slave rebellion, for which the penalty was death. So this is where Kirby Smith is getting that information. So what happened to those 107 men from the 11th Louisiana? What happened to some of the officers that were taken prisoner, like Corydon Heath? It was not clear for a long time. There were rumors, but it was hard to know what really happened. In August of 1863, so this is a couple of months after Milliken's Bend, Vicksburg has now fallen, Union General John Stevenson takes an expedition out to the west to Monroe, where the Confederates are. The Confederate forces retreat as the Yankees advance. Stevenson is only in Monroe literally for about 24 hours, because then he's told to go back to Vicksburg. But in the process, he performs an investigation, and he finds out that, in fact, 2 of the white officers captured at Milliken's Bend were indeed executed at Monroe sometime in June or July, and he takes a couple of eyewitness statements. African American soldiers, it is still much more difficult to find out what happened to them. Many of the records were lost at the Battle of Milliken's Bend, and quite frankly, the Confederates were not necessarily interested in keeping certain records of certain things. It does appear that many of the African Americans who were captured at Milliken's Bend were probably returned to slavery. It does also seem like at least some were treated as prisoners. Their service records show that they returned to their regiments from Texas sometime after the war, like in 1866. It doesn't say whether they were held as prisoners of war in a prisoner of war camp or if they were held in bondage as slaves. We don't know. It just says from Texas. We don't even know where in Texas. There's also a case not too far from Milliken's Bend with some different Confederate forces that indicates that some may have, in fact, been executed. So we're still, to this day, we're still trying to investigate this and see what really happened. But what are the ultimate outcomes then of Milliken's Bend? Again, it was a really small fight, 1,500 men on each side, right? During the Vicksburg campaign, it didn't do anything, from the Confederate side, it didn't do anything to relieve the siege of Vicksburg. From the Union side, Grant's army was already on the other side of the Mississippi, so in many ways it was just a little scrap, right? But what happens with Milliken's Bend is because of the prisoner of war issue, there are some national level impacts. Whoops, did I go the wrong way? I did. So Colonel Lead makes a report about what they found out when they went to Monroe about these executions. That report goes all the way up the chain to the Secretary of War and even a congressional investigating committee. And it plays a role in the breakdown of prisoner exchanges between North and South. Prior to this time, there was a system of prisoner exchanges where if you were taken prisoner, you could say, I solemnly swear I'm not going to take up arms within X amount of time and be released. At this point, the prisoner exchanges stop. And it's because the Confederates refused to treat black and white prisoners from African American units the same as any other prisoners. But that's not the only outcome of Milliken's Bend. I mentioned the other two battles at Port Hudson and Fort Wagner. Well, they each come very quickly during the summer of 1863. And prior to this time, there was a lot of skepticism among Northern whites about whether or not enlistment of African Americans in the military was a good idea, whether or not they would make good soldiers. But at every one of these battles, the black troops acquitted themselves well, with great courage, and fought with great ferocity. And that began to shift Union public opinion in the North. And in fact, there's a letter from a man, white Union soldier, not affiliated directly with any of the units at Milliken's Bend, but he's in the hospital. There is a hospital at Milliken's Bend. He's in the hospital and he writes his wife before the battle in a very dismissive tone and says, oh, there's a couple of black regiments near here. You should see them drill. It's pretty comical. And of course, they were new at their duties and responsibilities. They were new with poor weaponry. But he's very dismissive about it. But then after the Battle of Milliken's Bend, he has a complete change of heart. He writes his wife again and says, all are astonished at their fighting qualities. And so he had been converted from a skeptic as well. And then finally, Milliken's Bend was also used to increase recruiting among free blacks in the North as well. This is a part of a much larger recruiting poster that's signed off by probably about 100 different black leaders in the North, including Frederick Douglass. And you see that Milliken's Bend is specifically called out here for valor and heroism. And in this particular broadside, there's a passage also that says, are free men less brave than slaves? In other words, they're almost taunting free blacks in the North to say, look, your brothers in the South are already fighting on the front lines. Won't you come and join the army as well? And then finally, I would just like to leave you with this image. This is John Gordon. He fought at Milliken's Bend. This is a post-war image. He was only 15 when he fought at Milliken's Bend. And it's one of the few pictures at this point, as far as I know, it's the only picture that we have of one of the African American soldiers who were at Milliken's Bend. So that's the end of my formal presentation, and so I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention.
Linda, we'll go ahead and start. We've got one from the live stream. Can you just talk a little bit about Milliken's Bend? You mentioned that there towards the end, but the impact of the usage of those black soldiers at Milliken's Bend and Port Hudson, and if that would have any direct impact on the decision to use those soldiers at the 54th Massachusetts in Fort Wagner 6 weeks later.
Oh, wow. That's a really good question, and I had not considered that before. I would say probably not a direct impact, because I think that was already kind of in progress, and now I don't know if it may have given them more incentive, perhaps. May have been given their commander more incentive to say, hey, we'll lead the charge. But I'm not aware of any direct impact, but that's a very, very interesting question.
Is this site can people go there, or is it like Champions Hill where it's on private land and you really can't access it?
Thank you. Yes. Well, the site, as you saw, was right on the Mississippi River. So the site is actually gone, was washed away decades ago. And it's possible that there still may be a little bit, kind of here or there on either side of the river. But by and large, most of the battlefield is gone.
I read that by the end of the war, 10% of all federal troops were United States colored troops. I've kind of assumed that it would be roughly double that number in the Western Theater in Mississippi, but it's just an assumption, because about what percentage of the federal troops in Mississippi were USCT?
I don't know the figures specifically for Mississippi, but what I can tell you is, if my figures are right, I believe it was about 170,000 overall in the Union Army at the end of the war. And about 70,000 of them were recruited from the Mississippi Valley. So what, is that about maybe a third or so from this region? So
I had since Drew hasn't taken the mic yet, I'll give it back after this. I did also want to ask, although it's a year later, about the impact of Fort Pillow on policy, recruitment, et cetera.
yes. One of the things that, most of my research happens prior to that time, of course. And what I know is that the stand that the Union took in terms of just even legally what the North was doing did come about in 1863, so before Fort Pillow. I will also say that one of the regiments at Milliken's Bend fought at Fort Blakely at the very end of the war in Alabama. And there are, again, conflicting accounts, and quite frankly, I have not done the research on it. But it also seems like that some of both the Confederate and African American troops down there had an attitude of no quarter. As it relates to Fort Pillow, I'm not immediately aware of any direct connection in terms of Milliken's Bend and the policies that came out of Milliken's Bend. I've certainly read about Fort Pillow. I know about Fort Pillow, but I haven't studied it in the same way. So I don't feel like I have a very good answer for you on that. But I can tell you that I've seen the paper trail from Milliken's Bend. So I know that played into, it's not entirely responsible for that policy, but it certainly played into the policy that the North took regarding stopping prisoner exchanges until the South would recognize them as prisoners of war.
Thank you
Yes, sir.
for that brilliant, brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the impression that both sides, both the Union Army and the Confederate Army, agreed that the blacks who fought were outstanding. Bravery,
Yes.
gallantry,
Yes.
they were outstanding. And because of their outstanding performance, it had some direct effect on the siege that followed that would overcome Vicksburg. And Grant himself in his memoirs state what a brilliant performance the blacks performed during Milliken's that attack on Millikens. And so I'm wondering if after all this, the great performance of these blacks who had very little training, they'd not been there very long, and they had very little training because of their outstanding performance, which, according to Grant, impacted the result of the siege in Vicksburg. Were they able to, were the blacks able to benefit from their outstanding achievement?
Thank you. That's a really great question. Now, with the siege itself, to my knowledge, there were not any African American units that took part in the actual siege at Vicksburg. They did, however, garrison Vicksburg after Vicksburg fell. And in fact, 2 of the regiments that were at Milliken's Bend basically spent the rest of the war at Vicksburg. And it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of what happens afterwards. On the one hand, there are, personal accounts that talk about how the officers have their training in the day, and then in the evening they give their schoolhouse over to their soldiers, who are then getting an education. So there's that sort of benefit. They become, in Reconstruction, they become politically active, but that also, quite frankly, endangers their lives. There are many individuals who, even if they had been from Louisiana, who then go into Vicksburg and live there after the war. And one of the things too, and I thank you for mentioning Grant's quote from his memoirs, because he does say exactly what you said, that they did fight with great valor and courage. And so they are there as garrison troops after Vicksburg falls. There is today a monument there, as probably many of you know, in the Vicksburg Military Park, to the Mississippi troops of African descent. So I'm not sure, did I answer your question?
I just had a quick question where it seems to me that slaves made up a majority of the population in the Confederacy, but there wasn't a real push to arm or train them into the degree they really should have. It seems to me when you have these millions of people who know the terrain and have a very good reason to fight, it only makes sense that you try to recruit and train as many as you can, compared to some, I don't know, Yankees from New England or the Midwest that don't know the terrain, don't have as much of a reason to fight, or may even sympathize with the Confederates. Do you know if there was a specific reason from either higher command or from Congress or Lincoln as to why there was not a greater push for recruitment of blacks, or if it was just a matter of they didn't consider it, they didn't want to do it, or someone wanted to do it and it was pushed back against?
Right. Thank you. You do have a few people early in the war who are advocating for that. Certainly Frederick Douglass right from the beginning, but also white abolitionists who are advocating for the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. But that is kind of put down. And quite frankly, at that time, it was considered against white political opinion in the North. And so there was just not the public support for this. By the time you get to the middle of the war, Lincoln recognizes 2 things. One is that it's got to happen. At this point also, there are plenty of African Americans who are serving as laborers with the Union Army, driving mule teams, helping out in the quartermaster department, and so forth. So they are still aiding the Union cause, even though it's as a labor force. But also, pardon me, but also you have a situation where, sorry, I just lost the point I was trying to make. But you also have a situation where, this is it. that there are plenty of individual African Americans who are aiding the Union Army by just what you described, by telling them, go down this road, don't go down that road, here's a safe area, and so on. So they're very much aiding the Union cause. And just like I mentioned with the officers having different opinions, opinions varied considerably between public opinion in the North among civilians as well as the white Union soldiers. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that there were some who were opposed to it, because those guys in the 10th Illinois Cavalry that I talked about that came over to Shepherd's Camp, that regiment did not like serving near the African American regiments at Milliken's Bend. They were there and they could have aided in the fight, but they did not because they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So the answer is always it's complicated, but mostly it was public opinion. So.
Good morning. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
That I've heard, and I hope I don't repeat what you have already said.
That's okay.
I like his question about Abraham Lincoln, and today we know what wars, if we didn't know last year, we know this year what wars are all about. It's territorial. It has always been about territory and domination. You can't get some of us, especially my age, I'm only 21.5 years of age, but some of us just can't get it through our heads that the war was not just about freeing the slaves. There was an industrial component behind it. It was the Industrial Revolution was coming, and Southern labor was without question the labor force. So someone said something about being compensated as black soldiers. That was never the intention. The intention was to go and start the what do you call it? The Industrial Revolution with automobiles, factories. So we're still waiting to be compensated.
Yes.
Oh, and did the president not say, give those slaves guns because we were losing? Meaning the
Right.
South was losing.
Yes. That it was numbers that were right there, that they could enlist. So, thank you.
I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm somewhat familiar with Milliken's Bend and the regiments that you're talking about. One of the things that's really interesting, you made a couple of observations in the comments about the units being garrison troops in Vicksburg. What's from what I've read and things like Dyer's Compendium and various things like that, the term garrison doesn't quite cover what exactly was going on there. A lot of the troops did stay in Vicksburg, but there were units like the 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry and some of the units that showed up in Milliken's Bend were actively engaged in trying to put down guerrilla battles that were in the countryside. We tend to think, we look at history and we look at the little peaks that kick up there like Antietam and Gettysburg and Vicksburg. But in a lot of places, but particularly here in Mississippi, when the Army of the Tennessee left, the war had kept going on. And it was a struggle between trying to control the countryside, and at the same time you had people who were out there farming the abandoned plantations, and they were being murdered out in the fields. So put in that perspective, when you consider that the veterans of the 9th, 11th, and 13th Louisiana of African descent, the 1st Mississippi Cavalry African descent, they settled here in Vicksburg alongside the people that they were fighting out in the guerrilla campaigns. And that, when you talk about the political issues after the war, that plays very heavily into that.
Yes, thank you for those points. I really appreciate that. And I do, I should have said earlier that, what I shared today is probably maybe 25% of the story. So there's a whole lot more. And I do look specifically at the Reconstruction era and the violence that followed there and the effort of African Americans to assert and maintain their rights. So that's part of that as well. And thank you for bringing that up, that Garrison doesn't really cover it. I appreciate that. Anyone else?
Got one more from the live stream, Linda. The question was, do we have anybody that was present at Milliken's Bend that would go on that's notable? Somebody, the kind of reference was to Peter Crosby, somebody in the 5th Heavy Artillery who goes on to be Sheriff of Warren County. Afterwards, is there anybody that was participated in Milliken's Bend that kind of had that level of follow-up of prestige, of political position or power after Milliken's Bend?
That's a wonderful question, and what I can tell you is we're still doing the research. Part of it is, as I said, some of those records were lost in the conflict. We know men were there, and we don't even know their names, or if we do, all we've got is a name. That's it, a name on a piece of paper. We don't know where they're from. We don't know their age. We just don't know. And so it does make the research very difficult. I have a colleague right now who's doing a lot of work on tracing the individuals. I have not done as much work. So I don't feel like I can even answer that question, especially because I'm not from this area. So I wasn't aware even of Peter Crosby. So I appreciate that. I have reason to believe that there are more. I just don't know off the top of my head, and hopefully we'll find out more in the coming years.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to a top of another hour here at History is Lunch. Let's give Linda a round of applause. We have plenty of copies of Milliken's Bend, a Civil War battle in history and memory. It is an excellent read. I highly recommend it. And Linda would be happy to sign that copy for you as well. So once again,